Welcome back to Cosmological Investigations. In this video, we're going to look at a specific version of the cosmological argument called the Kalam cosmological argument. I'm going to unpack this argument and I'm going to share my own assessment of the different parts of the argument as we go. Now, just to give a brief review of the general cosmological argument so that we can see how the Kalam argument fits this general scheme. The general argument seeks to show that dependent things depend ultimately on something independent and special. So now let us look at the Kalam cosmological argument. Here's an opening outline of the argument. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. This is the causal principle in the argument. Cosmological arguments often will have a causal principle. I think of this as kind of the engine of the argument. It's the engine that allows the argument to run. The next premise is that the universe began to exist. From here, we conclude that the universe has a cause. The cause would, for various reasons, be special or supreme or have a godlike nature. And then if that's all correct, then it would follow that God exists. Now notice that this argument has the general structure of the cosmological argument. It has two parts. So the first part seeks to argue for some kind of cause of things, and then the second part seeks to identify the nature of that cause. We are going to look at both of these parts in this video. Here's a picture of the whole argument. I kind of like this picture because it illustrates the whole structure of the argument. There's a cosmos, which is, let's say, the sum total of all material reality, whatever that is. And first there's a choice in our thinking about the cosmos. Either the cosmos began to exist, or it never began. It's eternal. According to the Kalam cosmological argument, there's reason to think that the universe began to exist, and we'll talk about some of those reasons. The next choice point in the argument, then, is between the universe beginning without a cause or the universe beginning with a cause. According to the Kalam argument, if it begins to exist, then it has some cause, so something caused the cosmos to exist. Then the final choice point has to do with the identification of the cause. The complete argument would seek to show that the cause is in some sense personal. That obviously would be a very significant result because it would suggest that the kind of world we live in is a world that's governed in some way or is founded in some way by a personal reality. Now let's have a closer look at this argument. We're going to look at each of the steps more carefully. And let me just tell you right at the outset that this particular argument has not been one that has played a very significant role in my own thinking of ultimate reality. However, over the years, my thinking about this argument has developed in certain ways, and I'm going to share some of these developments as we continue. So let's look more carefully then at the first premise. This was the causal premise in the argument. This premise says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Why think that? Well, I'm going to briefly just point to three types of reasons that people will give sometimes in support of this premise. The first type of support comes from our experience with caused beginnings. For example, you might have an experience of starting a fire. You see the fire begin to exist, but you also witness the cause of that fire in some sense. Another type of support comes from the lack of experience of things beginning uncaused. For example, you don't see blue spheres just appear in front of your eyes uncaused. And this lack of experience seems to support the general principle that whatever begins to exist would have to have some sort of a cause. A third type of support, which is less well known in the popular discussions of this argument, is from epistemology. This is about our knowledge. How can we know things? You might think that knowledge is based on some rational support, but if things can just begin to exist without any cause, then what's to stop all of our beliefs and our experiences from beginning to exist uncaused? I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment. So let's have a closer look at each of these supports. The first support was that we experience caused beginnings. We seem to experience some kind of order or regularity in the world. And one way of explaining this order that we experience is in terms of a causal principle, that things that begin have some kind of a cause. If a fire begins, then there's some kind of cause of that fire. The causal principle seems to make good sense of this predictability of our experiences. Now, the argument here isn't supposed to be a knockdown proof. It's just to say, here's a hypothesis. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. And this hypothesis seems to match a wide range of our experiences. In fact, I've sometimes had the thought that every single scientific experiment reconfirms this general principle of cause and effect. Because every single experiment is an experiment where we observe some kind of a pattern that is then explained in terms of a causal order. A second support comes from our lack of experience of uncaused beginnings. We don't experience purple balls just randomly coming into being from nothing. And I'm not worried when I go outside that random objects will just flood into existence, or new universes will just come into being right in front of me and annihilate my experience of the order of things. Years ago, I had a friend who responded to this kind of argument saying that, well, if something did come into being from nothing, we couldn't know that it did come from nothing because we'd always assume that it would have some cause. Now, I actually don't think that this is a problem for this kind of support. Even if there's no way to observe that something's uncaused, even if it were uncaused, even if there's no way to verify that or observe that, that doesn't undermine this support for the causal principle. In fact, if the causal principle is a necessary truth, if it's a necessary truth that whatever begins to exist has a cause, then of course I wouldn't be able to verify that something begins uncaused. This isn't a problem for the principle. This is actually just what the principle predicts. So it seems to me that one could argue that this principle of cause and effect best explains both our experiences with a causal order together with our lack of experiences of random objects just appearing from nowhere. Okay, and then third, there's this argument from skepticism. To draw out this argument, consider what we might call the problem of gear solipsism. So gear solipsism is the hypothesis that you are made of uncaused gears that generate all of your current experiences. Your experience of hearing my voice, that's produced by the gears. And nothing else exists. There's just your experiences, and those are just produced by gears. And if you wonder, well, where do the gears come from? Those came into being 10 minutes ago uncaused. So that's the gear solipsist hypothesis. The question is, how do you rule out gear solipsism? Now, if you're like me, assuming that I'm real over here, gear solipsism strikes you as absurd. Okay, but what justifies the absurdity? How do you rule out gear solipsism? Now, there are different ways that you might try to respond to gear solipsism. One kind of response is to try to argue that the best explanation of your experiences is not going to be in terms of gears that just came into being uncaused. But this kind of response assumes that the best explanation is more likely than no explanation. Why think that? Why think the best explanation is more likely than no explanation? Now, at this point, maybe we've reached a kind of bedrock. And I think that that's probably right. I think that in order to get out of gear solipsism, we need some kind of a principle, like some principle of explanation or some principle of the causal order. So here's my view of how this works. I think that you have an inner sense, a sense by which you can discern general principles. And not all principles are based first on making observations about the world. And one of these principles is a general principle of explanation. That things that come into being are going to have some further explanation. And then it seems to me that in order to explain how or why something comes into being, the explanation is going to be, in some sense, in terms of some kind of a cause. And if that's right, then it seems like this principle of cause and effect, this principle that things that begin to exist have some kind of a cause, that would seem to make sense of an application of this more general principle of explanation. And if all of that is right, then this provides a kind of fence that blocks us from falling into this pit of skepticism. The fence is a kind of inner witness or an inner sight of general principles about reality that make sense of our experiences. Okay, so this is just a kind of introduction to some supports for this principle of cause and effect. Now, what I want to do next is turn to some common objections to the causal principle. These aren't all the objections that I've seen, but these seem to be the most common. First, people will sometimes point to science, and they'll say that The science of the small things, quantum mechanics, reveals to us that there are these little particles, virtual particles, that come into being completely uncaused. And if virtual particles can come into being uncaused, then perhaps the entire universe could come into being uncaused. Now, I think that this objection is very valuable because it helps us to clarify different types of causes. My response to the objection is that a cause can be indeterministic. When the physicists are talking about virtual particles appearing uncaused, the thought here isn't that these things come into being literally out of nothing without any prior condition for their existence. It's just that the prior conditions don't determine their existence, the existence of these particles, with 100% certainty. Now, somebody could still object here if they have a concept of cause that builds in determinism. I was talking about this particular objection with a friend who raised the objection. They suggested to me that science reveals that virtual particles are uncaused. And initially I responded by suggesting that, well, maybe the cause is non-deterministic. And their response to that was that would be a contradiction in terms, that causes by their very definition are deterministic. So when they suggested that, my response was to use a different word. I said, well, okay, let's use the word prior condition. Virtual particles emerge out of a prior condition. Without a prior condition, there wouldn't be those virtual particles. And we talked about that option, and as we did, that moved us past this objection. And so I don't want to stumble over words, because the Kalam cosmological argument can be given in terms of prior conditions. Whatever begins to exist has some prior condition. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has some prior condition. And then we can investigate, okay, what's the nature of the prior condition of the universe, if that argument is sound. So I think this first objection really helps to clarify that the kind of causation in play doesn't need to be deterministic. A second kind of objection that comes up sometimes is that things don't actually begin to exist. Things only rearrange. The thought here is that matter just rearranges into different forms, and so we don't actually have any experience of things beginning to exist. We only experience rearrangements of existing things. Now, my response to this is, again, just to clarify the argument. When I say that something begins to exist, I don't mean that it has to begin to exist from nothing. Now, let me be clear. I realize that certain defenders of the Kalam cosmological argument also believe that the universe began to exist from nothing. But this is not essential to the argument. We can think of a beginning in a broad way, so that it can include even the beginning of an arrangement. So a beginning of an arrangement will still count as a beginning. And this is consistent with the general Kalam argument. Just to illustrate this a bit, imagine, for example, that the universe comes into being not from nothing, but rather the universe is a kind of vibration or an arrangement of some more basic underlying substance. Maybe it's an underlying mind that's able to produce things, not literally from nothing, but rather by producing different forms within itself. Perhaps similar to the way in which you can produce within your own imagination different images, different thoughts, different experiences within yourself. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that this is the only way in which a cause might produce a universe or produce a beginning, but I'm just pointing out that there are different models that are fully compatible with this argument. The argument does not require that things come to be from nothing. Even the beginning of a smile will count as a beginning. And if you do begin to smile, I'm going to think that there's probably some cause of that smile. A third objection that sometimes comes up is that we can imagine uncaused beginnings. We could imagine, for example, a blue cube just begin to exist without a cause. Now, this objection targets a kind of strong principle that says that it's impossible for something to begin to exist uncaused. And the thought here is that if we can imagine something beginning to exist uncaused, that imagination reveals that it actually is possible for something to begin uncaused. And if it's possible, then maybe our universe began to exist uncaused. Now, there are different things one could say in response to this. For example, one response is to say that the causal principle doesn't have to be necessarily true. So maybe something can begin to exist uncaused. But that in our world, there's a kind of causal order and nothing actually begins to exist uncaused. Another idea is to say that you maybe can imagine uncaused beginnings, but that doesn't mean that those uncaused beginnings are actually possible. I actually have a different response than those responses. And the reason why I have a different response is because I'm inclined to think that if you can imagine something, then it actually is possible, in at least some significant sense of possible. And I'm also inclined to think that if beginnings actually do have a cause, that's because they must have a cause, and that an uncaused beginning is impossible in a strong sense. And so I have a different response. Here's my response. So I actually think that we can't imagine an uncaused beginning. What we can imagine instead is something similar but importantly different. Imagine a blue cube. And you could imagine that blue cube appearing in your visual field. And in this image of this blue cube appearing, you're not also imagining the blue cube having a cause. So what you're doing is you're forming an image of the blue cube without also having some image of its cause. But that's not the same as actually forming an image of no cause. What I mean is the act of causing something is not something that you can visualize as an image. If you cause yourself to have a thought, that causation is not something that you form a picture of. It's something else. It's a kind of power that you are aware of, but it's not something that you form an image of. And so I don't think that our imagination of things appearing and disappearing provides evidence that there could actually be something that exists without any cause or prior condition at all. Even in our images, even when we form images, those images come from prior states of reality. And again, the cause doesn't have to be a deterministic cause. It might be a kind of spontaneous cause of the image, but it's not uncaused. So I don't think we have any experience of anything uncaused, and I don't even think it's possible to genuinely imagine something existing uncaused in the sense of forming an image, a mental image of the lack of causation. A fourth objection, which I sometimes like to call an advanced objection, this objection is about the causing of the universe itself. So let's imagine that the universe began to exist and something caused the universe to exist. Well, then there's this causing of the universe. What caused the causing of the universe? And if you say that the causing of the universe was caused by something, well, then we have this further causing, the causing of the universe. Well, what caused that? This line of questioning leads to an infinite sequence of causing. And this seems like too much causing. This seems problematic. So in order to get out of this infinite chain of causing, it seems like what we have to say is that the causing of the universe began to exist uncaused. And that violates our causal premise. This is sort of a philosopher's objection. This is not the kind of objection I see people ordinarily raising, but is the kind of objection that philosophers sometimes get very worried about. I think thinking through this objection can lead to greater clarity about the nature of causation. I'm going to just share one thought with you. My one thought is that the causing is actually part of the effect. I talk about this in my book, How Reason Can Lead to God. I've got a chapter where I work through various objections, including this one. And there, what I suggest is that the causing is not some additional event that has to first be caused in order to produce the effect, but rather the causing is part of or subsequent to the effect. So if X causes Y, then by causing Y, X thereby also causes the causing of Y, and the causing of Y, all the way out to infinity. And whether this is an actual infinite or a potential infinite, we can just leave that to the side, because in either case, what I want to suggest here is that the causing is part of the effect. It's not an additional thing that has to first be caused in order to produce the effect. The final objection I want to consider here is that the first event is special. It's special because we have no experience with a first event. Maybe every event other than the first event has a cause, but why think the first event has a cause? This event might be special. It might be the one uncaused beginning. My friendly response to this is to suggest that, okay, well, maybe the first event is special, but then I would need some reason to make a special exception. Consider by comparison the events of tomorrow. The events of tomorrow are special because never in the history of the world have the events of tomorrow existed. We have no experience with the events of tomorrow. So in that sense, they're special. Somebody might think, well, maybe the events of tomorrow will exist completely uncaused. Maybe as soon as tomorrow happens, blue cubes and universes and all sorts of things will just snap into being uncaused because it's tomorrow and tomorrow is a special day. I think the right response is that even though we have no experience with tomorrow, everything we do have experience with suggests and predicts that events have a cause, even tomorrow. Changing the time and the place of the event seems to be an irrelevant difference. Now, maybe somebody has some reason to think that there is some relevant difference between tomorrow or the first event. And in that case, then they have some reason to think that the principle of cause and effect isn't general. But the whole point here is that if you don't have some reason to think that a certain event is an exception to the rule, then all of your experience gives you reason to think that it has a cause. I think it's helpful here to not think of the Kalam argument as a knockdown proof, but rather to think of it as a device for exploring reality. Consider it from your own perspective. Do you have reason to think that change in time or space is a relevant difference to a change with respect to having a cause? If you do, then you have a reason to be skeptical that every event has a cause. But if you don't have a reason to think that these changes are relevant to causation, then you're in a different position. And so I think it's helpful just to consider it from your own perspective. When I think about it from my perspective, it seems like I have lots of experience with events having a cause or some prior condition. And furthermore, it seems to me to be a principle of reason that events have some explanation. They don't just happen without any kind of explanation at all. And if that's right, this gives me some reason to expect that any given event will have some prior cause or condition. If there's an exception to this rule, then I'm going to want some special reason to make that exception. Okay, now let's look at the second premise. The universe began to exist. There are different kinds of supports for this premise. Here are two types, general types. There are scientific arguments for a beginning. These are from empirical observations. And then there are more philosophical arguments based on rational intuitions, reflection on the nature of an infinite series of events, or a beginningless past. One limitation of the scientific arguments is that even if they show that the universe has some kind of a beginning, and even if that beginning has some kind of a cause, there's still a further question about whether that cause of the universe itself has a cause, and whether the cause of the cause also has a cause all the way out to infinity. It's not that the scientific arguments have nothing to say about an infinite past. It's just that often they'll be focused on an infinite past of a certain type, of, let's say, states of energy coming from other states of energy. So I want to have a closer look at these philosophical arguments. These philosophical arguments are about problems with infinite chains. There are three types of problems that philosophers will think about. There's problems with infinity. So some philosophers have argued that there can't be any kind of actual infinite quantity of things. For many years, I had no problem myself with thinking that there are actual infinities. It seemed to me that, well, of course there are infinitely many numbers. Mathematicians are discovering all sorts of properties of numbers. And these discoveries are only possible if the numbers are already there to be discovered. More recently, however, I've begun to rethink this. There are ways of understanding mathematical discoveries without thinking of the mathematical universe as already there. I'm not currently quite sure what to think about this. This is an open question for me. Those who argue against infinities will often point to certain types of paradoxes with certain kinds of infinite scenarios, such as a scenario where there's an infinite hotel with infinitely many rooms, and each room is completely occupied. You might think if there were such a hotel, it's completely full, you couldn't add more people to the hotel without doubling up the rooms, because every room is already occupied. But if the hotel is infinite, then we can open up more space by sending everybody down a room. Everybody could go down a room. The person in room 1 could go into room 2. The person in room 2 could go into room 3, all the way out. And this opens up more space so that now room 1 is open and somebody could go in. There's something strange about this scenario. It might seem sort of counterintuitive that something completely full could still make space to add new things into it. Now, for many years, my general response has been to think that, well, this weirdness, this strangeness is just part of the strangeness of infinity. Infinity just is weird. And maybe that's right. Maybe infinity is just weird. A question to consider is whether the weirdness of infinity is a signpost of the impossibility of infinity, or whether the weirdness of infinity is just a signpost of infinity being very different from what we're accustomed to. A second type of problem has to do with completion. For example, could somebody complete an infinite task? I've asked my kids about this to test their intuitions. I would ask them, could somebody successfully climb out of a bottomless pit without ever starting, as long as he had been climbing from all of eternity? Now, my kids have the intuition that these things are just not possible. I've been unsure about what to make of their intuition because I don't know if they're fully understanding the scenario. When I think about it, I do find something puzzling about completing an infinite task. And it doesn't seem to help to say that, well, as long as you don't start the task, well, then you could finish the task. That seems weird to me. But maybe the weirdness is part of the weirdness of infinity. A third type of problem is about recombination. This third problem has affected my thinking about causal chains. And so I want to just share with you more about this kind of problem of recombination. So I'm going to tell you a story that's going to illustrate a certain problem with recombination. This is an original story. You're not going to find this anywhere else unless I share this in another context. But I've provided this story to illustrate a general problem of recombination. So the story goes like this. Once upon a time, in a world with an infinite past, a strange event occurred. A chicken crossed the road. Why? In order to make a contradiction. That's why he crossed the road. And he succeeded. Okay, I got to give you the backstory so you can understand how this chicken produced this contradiction. Now let me just note, we're considering a world with an infinite past. So in this world, an infinite number of events has taken place. Now here's the backstory. The chicken, whom I shall call Bob, is actually a machine. And this machine is programmed to lay an egg. Bob will lay the egg at a specific time set on its clock. So this chicken Bob has a clock. It's set to 10:39. And Bob will lay his egg at this time only if no other chicken along his side of the road has already laid an egg. So as it happens, there are infinitely many other chickens on his side with the same program. Now these other chickens are behind this chicken here, so you can't see them. But they also have clocks, and each of their clocks are set to a different time. As it happens, their clocks are set to times that form a series of times that converge to 10:39 a.m. Now, if you're familiar with the Grim Reaper paradox, you'll know what I'm talking about here. Because in the Grim Reaper paradox, you have the same kind of situation with events that are converging to some initial time. Basically, the idea here is that for every chicken that has a clock at some time set to some time close to 10:39, there's another chicken with a clock that's closer to 10:39. But no chicken's clock is set exactly to 10:39 except for Bob's. Bob's is set at exactly 10:39. So in this scenario, okay, bear with me here. In this scenario, Bob, if he stays on this side with all the other chickens, then he's going to lay the egg at 10:39. He's going to lay the egg at 10:39 because he lays the egg only if no other chicken has already laid the egg. Well, Bob's time is the earliest time, 10:39, and every other time is after Bob's time. So if he stays on this side of the road, he'll lay the egg, and the other chickens will just do nothing. They won't lay their eggs because an egg has already been laid. However, if Bob crosses the road, then his program doesn't apply. It doesn't apply because he's not on the right side of the road. It's part of his program to only work, to only lay that egg if he's on this side of the road. What this means is that Bob is going to leave the other chickens in a contradictory mess. Why? Because at every time after 1039, an egg must already have been laid by a previous chicken. Because think about this, at every time after 1039, let's say it's 1040, there's infinitely many chickens that have clocks set to times that are before 1040. There's 1039.5, there's 1039.25, there's 1039.125, and so on. So no chicken can lay an egg because at every time, there was already a time when a chicken should have already laid an egg by its program. The contradiction here is that no chicken can be the one to lay the egg because at every time, the egg would have already been laid. But that means an egg was laid, but no chicken lays the egg. That's not just strange, that's contradictory. Now, when I think about the impossibility of this scenario, it suggests to me that there's got to be something wrong with this setup. Obviously, because the setup leads to a contradiction. And contradictions seem to be impossible. It doesn't matter whether there's finitely many things or infinitely many things, no matter how many things there can't be a contradiction. And what this story illustrates is that if you could have an infinite past, then you could set up a strange scenario where some chicken, if it decides to cross the road, is going to make it the case that there's a contradiction. But of course, you can't make a contradiction. Contradictions are impossible. What this illustrates is that this scenario is impossible. Here's the argument. If an infinite causal chain is possible, then the chicken story is possible. Now, we might support this principle by a more general principle of what I call finite recombination. An example would be that any finite intrinsic changes to any chickens would be possible. For example, you might think that if there could be an infinite past, then over that infinite amount of time, there could be infinitely many different things that are produced. And those things could have different features like clocks or programs. And then there's this principle that whatever features they have, you could make any finite intrinsic changes to any number of those things. And that would be a possible reality. The idea is that if there could be an infinite past, then there's nothing to really stop any of the chickens from crossing the road or from having the clock set to the particular times that they have. And if that's right, well, then it seems like one has some support for this first premise, that if an infinite causal chain is possible, then something like the chicken story would also be possible. But the chicken story is not possible. It involves a contradiction. That chicken might think, surely I can cross the road, and maybe it could cross the road if the scenario were actually possible. But the chicken cannot cross that road because that results in a contradiction. And from these premises, it would then follow that an infinite causal chain is impossible. Now, this is just an introduction to this type of argument. I have provided a more detailed analysis on my blog, which I will link to below this video. And on my blog, I also considered different ways one might respond to this argument. I don't want to suggest that this argument is a decisive argument, but this argument does weigh in my mind. When I think about my own history of thinking about infinite regresses, this is what it was like for me. I first began to think about these problems with infinity, but I always just kind of thought, well, that's just part of the weirdness of infinity. Then I thought about these problems of completing an infinite task. This seemed to hold more weight for me. But even then, it didn't seem as clearly problematic as a contradiction. So I never responded to these scenarios by saying, if there could be an infinite past, there still couldn't be somebody who climbs up out of a bottomless pit. I didn't deny the kind of recombination. If there could be an infinite past, then through some recombination of the materials, there could be somebody who successfully finishes an infinite task, like climbing out of a bottomless pit. Instead, my response was that the result, though weird, wasn't so weird. But when it comes to the recombination argument, now the weirdness is turned all the way to a contradiction. And this is too much weirdness. Now, at this point, the most common type of response is to deny this recombination principle. I find it interesting that this kind of response, denying a recombination principle, doesn't come up in response to the first sorts of arguments against infinity. People don't say that, well, look, maybe there could be an infinite past, but there couldn't be somebody climbing out of an infinite pit. People don't say that. Instead, the response is that if there could be an infinite past, then there could be weird things like climbing up out of a bottomless pit or an infinite hotel with all the rooms full and still making room for more people. Those things are weird, but those things don't tell us that we need to deny infinity, and they don't suggest that we need to deny the recombination principle. It seems to me that the kind of response to this recombination argument, that it's the recombination principle that's the problem, actually reveals a kind of advance in the dialectic, in the inquiry into infinities. I think it actually shows that the pain of the contradiction is so powerful that in order to maintain the infinite regress, we have to say something more dramatic, something that we didn't even consider saying in response to the previous arguments against infinity. Now we see that the only way for there to be an infinite causal chain is if none of these relevant recombination principles are true. Now again, I don't want to be too bold here in my conclusions. Instead, all I want to do is just invite you to consider the argument from your own perspective. Now let's come back to the overall Kalam argument. Remember the argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This cause would be God. Therefore, God exists. Well, why think, even if the universe has a cause, that the cause would be God? Why think that? Well, let's have a closer look. Now, for simplicity, I'm going to let the term the cause refer to the first uncaused cause of everything else. I'm going to assume, for sake of argument here, that the causal chain is finite, and so there's a first member, and that this member is uncaused. It exists without anything causing it to exist. What kind of a thing could that be? Here are a few classical considerations. I don't mean to suggest that any of these considerations are decisive, but just that these are some common considerations that are relevant to the nature of the cause. One thought is that in order for the cause to produce all of its effects, the cause would have to be enormously powerful. You can think of power as that ability to produce effects. It can produce the entire universe. Second, if we're talking about a cause of the entire material world, then this would be a reason to think that the cause is not itself material, because that which is material would be part of the effect. So if there is a cause of the material world, if the material world had a beginning, then the cause of the material world would be immaterial. Now, one might respond to this by suggesting that maybe the material world didn't have a beginning. Maybe the material world divides into two types. There's matter that began to exist, and then there's this first cause, which is material, but that didn't begin. However, if the first cause is immaterial, then you might argue that this cause would be a mind or be mind-like. Some of you may be familiar with this kind of argument from William Lane Craig. He suggests that the most plausible candidates for something that's both immaterial and capable of causing effects is a mind. The only other kind of immaterial thing would be an abstract object like the number 2, but abstract objects don't have the power to produce a mind. Now, this kind of argument is not meant to be a knockdown proof, but rather you might think of this as a kind of argument for the best explanation. We're trying to figure out what's the best account of this first cause from the things that we know about. A fourth kind of consideration is that a first cause would be capable of personal agency. Why think that? When I was in graduate school, I had a conversation with William Lane Craig about this very issue, and I asked him, why couldn't it instead be the case that the first cause is a kind of timeless or changeless entity that spontaneously produces change? And his response was very interesting. He suggested to me that in that case, what you would have is a timeless state being a cause of a temporary event. And he had the intuition that state-event causation is not a possible kind of causation. You can have maybe events causing other events, or you can have an agent, a personal agent, causing other events, but you can't have a timeless state that causes an event. If that's correct, and I just invite you to consult your own intuitions about that, but if state-event causation is impossible, then perhaps the next best option is agent-event causation, where the cause of the first event of the universe is some kind of personal agent. Okay, now, each of these classical considerations invites more investigation. And I actually think that progress on this kind of argument can occur through further reflection on these considerations. Any one of these could be a research project in its own right. And rather than close any of these off or decisively get behind any of these, I would like to just point to these as open avenues for further inquiry. I would like to conclude this presentation by getting one more argument on the table, one more thing to think about as an open area for inquiry. I'm going to call this the argument from limits. For some of you, this argument will look familiar because it grows out of work in my book, How Reason Can Lead to God. The argument is designed to show that the first cause would have a perfect nature. The argument goes like this. Premise 1, whatever lacks a perfect nature would have some fundamental limit. For example, a limit in power or a limit in person-building resources. That is, it has some limit in its ability to produce a world that can unfold to produce beings like us, people. The thought here is that only something with a completely perfect nature could lack any fundamental limit. If it doesn't have a completely perfect nature, then it's going to have some particular fundamental limit somewhere, some limit in its being. Premise 2, whatever has some fundamental limit has some cause to explain or set that limit. Rather than develop a full case for this premise, I want to just suggest that the same kind of considerations in support of the Kalam causal principle, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, might also be used to support this principle. For example, you might think this principle fits well with our experience of the causal order of limits having causes or explanations. Third, the first cause does not have a cause because it's the first cause. So by definition, because it's first, it doesn't depend on some prior cause that produced it. But then if everything that has a fundamental limit does have a cause, then this first cause does not have a fundamental limit. And if whatever lacks a perfect nature does have a fundamental limit, then it follows that this first cause has a perfect nature. If this argument is sound, well then it seems like the ultimate cause of reality would be very, very special indeed, because it would be something that has a completely perfect nature without any fundamental limit or boundary. Now I'm just getting this argument on the table here. I will come back to this kind of argument when we look at arguments from contingency in subsequent videos. So here is my overall assessment of the Kalam cosmological argument. Here's a form of the argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. That seems well supported by experience. The universe began to exist. Well, it seems like if the universe began to exist in some Big Bang event, let's say, then whatever caused the universe, assuming that whatever begins to exist has a cause, whatever caused the universe would itself either be caused or uncaused. It seems like, to me, that these recombination arguments have weight in my mind. And they lead me to think that even if the universe's cause, even if the cause had a cause, there's got to be some first cause in this chain of causes that is itself uncaused. And if that's right, we could say that the universe has a cause in terms of something that's uncaused. Now, what's the nature of this uncaused thing? Well, we looked at some considerations. And speaking for myself, it does seem promising that this cause would be special in a way that distinguishes it from the kinds of things that have a cause. And it seems to me that having a supreme nature or a perfect nature would make it relevantly different from the kinds of things that we see that have a cause. So what is my overall assessment of the argument? Well, this argument has not been my favorite argument, but over the years, the argument has grown on me. Whatever you think of this argument, I hope this presentation provides a helpful overview of the kinds of considerations relevant to thinking about the Kalam cosmological argument. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions about this video, feel free to share with me your questions, and I would love to consider your questions and see if I can provide some helpful insights.